There's a specific kind of embarrassment attached to giving an amount so small you wonder whether it counts. You know the arithmetic. You've done it more than once, standing there with the envelope, calculating what's left in the account against what still has to come out of it before the next paycheck. The number you can actually put in feels less like generosity and more like a gesture, almost like an apology. That feeling doesn't require poverty in any formal sense. It shows up in ordinary budgets stretched a little thinner than usual, in a month with an unexpected repair or a smaller paycheck than normal. The embarrassment isn't proportional to how poor someone actually is. It's proportional to the gap between what feels expected and what's currently possible. Sometimes it produces a decision to skip entirely, not out of unwillingness, but out of a sense that showing up with almost nothing might be worse than showing up with nothing at all. The gap between what feels appropriate and what's actually possible becomes its own small weight. You carry it into a room where nobody else appears to be carrying it. Mark records a scene that happens directly inside that experience, in the courtyard of the Jerusalem temple, sometime during the final week of Jesus' life. The timing matters. This falls within the last few days before the crucifixion, in a stretch of narrative dense with confrontation. Jesus has cleared the temple courts. He's been questioned by chief priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes in sequence, each group attempting to trap him. The atmosphere across this whole section is tense and public, and in the middle of it, he stops and sits down to watch people put money in a box. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched. The detail deserves attention before anything else in the passage. The Greek verb describing what he did means to sit down deliberately in a chosen position. This wasn't a passing glance while walking through. He selected a spot facing the treasury and stayed there long enough to observe a pattern in how people gave. Sitting also carried meaning in that setting. Teachers sat to teach. It was the posture of someone settling in with intent rather than passing through, which means the position itself signaled attention. Consider what that produces as an image. A man deliberately positions himself where he can see how a crowd handles money and remains there, not sampling, watching. That kind of sustained attention was unusual enough to be worth Mark recording as its own detail. Most figures in the Gospels are described doing something, moving through a scene, speaking, healing, teaching while walking. This is one of the rare moments where the narrative slows down specifically to describe him sitting still and observing. No other action gets attached to the posture itself. The temple treasury in that era consisted of 13 trumpet-shaped receptacles arranged along the wall of the court of women, each designated for different offerings. Coins dropped into metal made noise. Larger amounts made more noise for longer. Anyone giving substantially would have been audible to everyone standing nearby, whether or not they intended to be. The court of women was the outermost area of the temple that Jewish women could enter, that made it one of the busiest spaces in the complex. Pilgrims passed through it constantly. Anyone giving there did so in full view of a moving crowd. The acoustics of the receptacles turned every deposit into a public announcement of its own size. The design almost guaranteed comparison. A person with substantial means could produce a sustained rattle of coins. A person with 2 lepta produced 2 small sounds and nothing more, in a space where everyone nearby could hear the difference. That auditory contrast turns what might otherwise have been a private act of devotion into something closer to public performance. This happens whether the giver intended it or not. Wealth announced itself involuntarily through sheer physical volume. Poverty, by the same mechanism, announced itself too in the opposite direction. Many rich people threw in large amounts, the text says, and then a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, worth a fraction of a day's wage. The coins were called lepta. They were the smallest denomination in circulation in Palestine at that time. 2 of them together amounted to roughly 1/64th of a day's wage for a labourer. Mark adds a clarifying note for his Roman readers, explaining that 2 lepta equal 1 quadrans. That detail tells you something about the intended audience. and also about how genuinely small the amount was. It required translation into a second currency system just to convey how little it represented. To put it in practical terms, 2 lepta wouldn't have covered a meal. They might have bought a handful of grain, possibly less depending on the season and local prices. This wasn't a modest gift. It was an amount that had almost no purchasing power on its own. Roman coinage of the period included denominations far larger than the lepton, which made the lepton essentially the floor of the entire monetary system. There was nothing smaller she could have given. Whatever she put in the treasury that day represented the absolute minimum unit of currency available to her, doubled. There's a detail in that number most people move past without noticing. She had 2 coins, which means she could have kept one. Splitting the amount was available to her. She could have given half, retained half, and still participated in the offering. Nobody watching would have known the difference. The sound of 2 lepta and the sound of 1 lepta are effectively identical against the metal of a trumpet-shaped receptacle. The choice to give both was entirely private, entirely voluntary, and would have been invisible to every human being in that courtyard. That single detail separates this account from a story about a person with no options. She had one option, exactly one, and it was small. She used it anyway. Consider what keeping 1 coin would have meant practically. It would have bought almost nothing, but it would have been something. A small buffer between her and complete emptiness for whatever came next that day. The difference between 1 lepton and 0 lepta is negligible in purchasing power and enormous in what it represents about a decision. Then Jesus calls his disciples over and says something that contradicts basic arithmetic. This poor widow has put in more than all the others, not more sacrificially, not more meaningfully in some abstract spiritual sense that leaves the actual numbers intact. More. He states it as a plain comparison, then explains the measurement he's using. That word choice deserves attention on its own. Jesus doesn't say she gave as much, or gave comparably despite her circumstances. He says more, using ordinary comparative language applied to an outcome that ordinary comparison would never produce. He's not softening the math. He's replacing it with a different one entirely, stated as plainly as the first. The fact that he calls the disciples over is itself part of the account. They hadn't seen it. Whatever they'd been doing in that courtyard, it wasn't watching the treasury. The moment would have passed unremarked if he hadn't interrupted to point at it. Jesus had to actively redirect their attention towards something they'd walked past. That detail says something about how easily this kind of thing goes unnoticed, even by people standing directly beside it. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had to live on. The measurement is proportional rather than absolute. What matters, in the accounting Jesus describes, isn't the amount that entered the treasury. It's the relationship between what was given and what remained afterward. Proportional measurement produces results that look strange next to absolute ones. A large gift from abundant resources ranks below a tiny gift from nothing, because the ratio inverts the ranking completely. By ordinary accounting, the widow contributed the least of anyone that day. By the ratio Jesus applied, she contributed the most. Neither measurement is dishonest. They simply answer different questions. One asks how much arrived. The other asks how much it cost. By that measure, the widow's 2 coins outweigh everything else deposited that day. The rich gave from surplus and retained their surplus, while she gave from insufficiency and retained nothing. The Greek phrase describing what she gave carries more weight than most translations convey. It can mean her whole living, her entire livelihood, everything she had to sustain herself, not her spare change, not what she'd budgeted for religious obligations, the full remainder of her resources. That distinction changes the nature of the act. She wasn't giving generously within a plan. She was giving past the point where any plan remained possible, entering the rest of that day with nothing at all. Most people carrying financial strain assume their contribution registers somewhere near 0. The reasoning feels obvious from inside it. Ministries have budgets. Budgets require actual sums. A small amount is a small amount regardless of how it's framed. That logic isn't irrational. It's how nearly every other transaction in life works. A small payment covers a small portion of a bill. A small donation funds a small fraction of a project. Scale determines impact almost everywhere else, which makes it reasonable to assume it works the same way here. What the passage does is introduce a second measurement running alongside the first one, without cancelling it. The budget still needs the larger gifts to function. The treasury still counted the actual coins. Jesus doesn't dispute any of that. He introduces a different question entirely, about cost rather than volume, and answers it differently. That assumption runs directly into this passage without much room to maneuver. Jesus isn't offering the widow a consolation prize or a kind word to soften an uncomfortable comparison. He's stating an evaluation and explaining the standard behind it in front of witnesses. The language he uses puts her contribution above every other one made that day. Something else in the surrounding text sharpens the scene considerably. The verses immediately before this account contain a warning. Jesus has been describing the scribes, criticizing those who like walking around in flowing robes, receiving greetings in marketplaces, taking the most important seats in synagogues. Then he names something specific. They devour widows' houses, and for a show make lengthy prayers. That accusation appears in verse 40. The widow appears in verse 41. Mark places them adjacent to each other without a break in the scene. The phrase about devouring widows' houses likely refers to specific practices. Scribes sometimes served as legal trustees for estates, managing property for widows who had no other representation, and could extract substantial fees for that service. Others accepted extended hospitality from households that could barely afford to provide it, treating support as owed to them by virtue of their position. Whatever the exact mechanism, the accusation names a system that transferred resources from the most vulnerable people upward under religious cover. The phrase Jesus attaches to it is worth noting. For a show they make lengthy prayers. The exploitation and the piety weren't separate activities running in parallel. The piety was part of the mechanism, the thing that made the arrangement possible in the first place. Nobody hands their estate to a man they distrust. The extended public prayers established the credibility that made the trusteeship plausible. The proximity changes the texture of what follows. This isn't simply a heartwarming story about generous giving inserted at random. It arrives immediately after Jesus condemned a religious establishment that exploited exactly this category of person. Then he watches a member of that exact category give everything she had to the institution those men represented. Both things sit in the text together. Jesus praises her giving. He also, moments earlier, condemned the system receiving it. Nothing in the passage resolves that tension for the reader. He doesn't stop her. He doesn't return her coins or comment on whether the treasury deserved them. The account simply holds both realities side by side and moves forward into the next chapter, where Jesus predicts the temple's complete destruction. Financial shame rarely shows up as a clear thought about money. It arrives through smaller, more specific moments. The mental math done quickly before the offering plate reaches your row. A stewardship series announced from the front, and the immediate calculation of how many weeks it will run. Declining an invitation to a small group meeting at a restaurant, with a reason that isn't quite the real reason. The awkwardness of an online giving portal that displays suggested amounts, all of them higher than what you can do. A church directory listing giving levels for a building campaign. A conversation among friends about a mission trip cost, where saying nothing is easier than explaining. Digital giving has sharpened some of this in ways paper envelopes didn't. Amounts are now recorded, time-stamped, and often visible to whoever administers the system. The anonymity that once came standard with dropping cash into a plate no longer applies by default. That change is mostly administrative rather than intentional. Nobody designed it to expose anyone. It simply removed a layer of privacy that used to exist without anyone noticing it was there. Some churches have tried to address this directly, offering cash options specifically to preserve anonymity for people uncomfortable with recorded digital amounts. That the accommodation exists at all confirms something. The concern is widespread enough to require a designed response, not an isolated feeling limited to a handful of people. There's also a quieter version tied to church membership itself. Some people carry a private sense that their attendance costs the church more than they contribute, as though presence were a transaction requiring offset. That calculation runs silently and almost never gets voiced, which means it also almost never gets corrected. Parents feel a specific edge of this when children are involved. Youth trips, camp fees, event costs that come with a suggested amount and a deadline. The conversation about scholarships or reduced rates exists in most churches. Having it requires identifying yourself as someone who needs it, in front of a person you'll see again every week. For anyone who grew up watching a parent navigate that, the memory tends to persist. Some of the most durable financial shame is inherited rather than developed, formed early by watching an adult handle a shortfall with visible strain. That inherited version can outlast the circumstances entirely. Someone whose finances have long since stabilized may still feel the old reflex when money and church appear in the same sentence. The body remembers a tension the bank account no longer reflects. There's a particular version of this for people who once gave more than they can now. Circumstances changed. The amount changed with them. What lingers is a private sense of having moved from one category to another, from contributor to something less clearly defined, without anyone announcing the transition. The widow occupied that category permanently. Widowhood in first-century Palestine meant losing not only a spouse, but the economic structure attached to him. The society had limited legal mechanisms for women to hold property or generate independent income. She wasn't temporarily short. She was structurally poor, with no realistic path out of it. The Hebrew scriptures address this repeatedly. Widows appear alongside orphans and foreigners in a recurring formula throughout the law and the prophets. They're identified as the categories of people most easily overlooked and most in need of deliberate protection. The frequency of those commands suggests the problem was persistent enough to require constant restating, which makes the scribe's behavior in verse 40 a violation of something explicitly, repeatedly commanded, not a grey area, a direct inversion of instructions that appear across multiple books. That inversion is precisely what makes the widow's own faithfulness so striking by comparison. She belonged to the category the law specifically instructed the powerful to protect. Instead, she experienced the opposite from at least some of the people entrusted with that protection. Her response wasn't withdrawal or bitterness toward the institution that had failed her. It was 2 coins, given anyway, and she gave anyway, twice over, when giving half would have been indistinguishable to everyone watching. You don't need your contribution to be substantial before it registers. The standard Jesus describes measures something entirely different from volume, and by that standard, the smallest deposit made that day ranked first. That reframing doesn't erase the practical reality of a tight budget. Bills stay the same size regardless of how giving gets measured spiritually. What shifts is narrower. The question of whether a small amount is worth giving at all gets answered directly in this passage. It's answered by someone who sat down specifically to watch. The answer isn't that small amounts become large. It's that the scale being used was never the one most people assume. A gift that costs nothing and a gift that costs everything can be the same number and remain entirely different transactions, which means the shame attached to a small amount is measuring by a standard the passage explicitly sets aside, not dismisses, sets aside in favor of a different question that produces a different ranking. Worth noting what Jesus does not say in this account. He doesn't tell the disciples to imitate her. He doesn't turn the moment into an instruction about how much anyone else should give. He describes what happened and explains how he weighed it. And the passage moves on. That restraint matters for how the story gets applied. Read as a command. It becomes pressure on people who already have very little. Read as an observation. It becomes something else entirely, closer to a correction of how value gets assigned than a demand for greater sacrifice. The distinction shows up in how the passage tends to get preached. Used one way, it produces guilt in exactly the people it describes with admiration. Used the other way, it produces something closer to relief. It establishes that the metric most people assume is operating isn't the one Jesus applied. Both readings pull from the same 4 verses. Which one lands depends heavily on who's in the room and what they're already carrying. Preachers reaching for a stewardship illustration sometimes lean toward the first reading without meaning to, because it produces a more actionable takeaway. Give more. Give sacrificially. The second reading resists that kind of application, since it isn't really about giving more at all. It's about how giving gets weighed once it's already happened, which offers less to build a fundraising appeal around and more to simply notice. That difference in usefulness for institutional purposes might explain why the guilt-producing reading circulates more widely than the relief-producing one. One version motivates behavior. The other simply describes reality, and descriptions rarely make effective appeals. She also wasn't performing. Nobody knew her name. The disciples weren't watching until Jesus called them over, which means they'd missed the entire thing until he pointed it out. She dropped 2 coins into a receptacle in a crowded courtyard and walked away, presumably assuming nothing about the moment had been noticed by anyone. Something worth sitting with there. The most commended act of giving in the Gospels happened without an audience and without recognition. The person giving it had no idea it was being observed at all. Compare that to the scribes described a few verses earlier. Their giving, whatever form it took, happened inside a whole apparatus of visibility. Robes, greetings, prominent seats, lengthy public prayers. The contrast mark constructs runs along exactly this line, between religion arranged for observation and an act that nobody arranged at all. The widow's anonymity has persisted for 2,000 years. She has no name in the text, no family mentioned, no town of origin, no detail beyond her status and her 2 coins. Whatever else she did with her life went unrecorded entirely. What survived instead is 4 verses describing a single unremarkable action. It was preserved because one person happened to be sitting in a position to see it and considered it worth mentioning. That's a strange kind of permanence, not fame exactly. She isn't known, but the act itself outlasted the building it happened in and the institution that received it. It outlasted every name of every wealthy person who gave more that same afternoon. Read Mark chapter 12 from verse 38 through verse 44. Most versions of this story circulate detached from the surrounding verses. The widow appears alone, framed as an example of sacrificial generosity, with nothing before or after it. That framing isn't wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that changes the meaning considerably. Reading them separately produces 2 unrelated lessons. Reading them as a single continuous passage produces something considerably more uncomfortable and more honest. Righteous anger at exploitation and genuine admiration for the exploited person's faith exist in the same breath, unresolved. Read what comes immediately after, too. The very next verse begins with a disciple pointing at the temple buildings, remarking on the massive stones and impressive structures. Jesus responds by telling him not one stone will be left on another. The sequence lands hard when read in order. A widow gives her last coins to the temple. A disciple admires the temple's architecture. Jesus announces the whole thing is coming down. Herod's temple was genuinely impressive. Some of the foundation stones were enormous, and the complex had been under construction and expansion for decades. The disciples' remark wasn't naive. It was the reasonable reaction of someone standing in front of one of the ancient world's more remarkable buildings. Josephus, writing later as a historian with first-hand knowledge of the structure, described stones so large. Their dimensions alone impressed visitors regardless of religious conviction. The building represented decades of labor and enormous expense, a genuine wonder by any standard available at the time. 40 years later, it was rubble. The Roman destruction in the year 70 left almost nothing of the structure standing. Her gift went into an institution with a short remaining lifespan. It was given to a system Jesus had just condemned, inside a building he was about to say would be destroyed. None of that changes his assessment of what she did. The account ends without telling us what happened to her. She walks out of the narrative permanently after 4 verses. No follow-up, no provision recorded, no note about whether her circumstances improved afterward. That silence is consistent with how the passage handles everything else. It doesn't resolve the tension with the scribes. It doesn't explain whether she should have given. It doesn't report an outcome. The account simply records what she did, what Jesus said about it, and stops. Whatever weight her 2 coins carried, it wasn't contingent on a story that ended well. That's an uncomfortable thing to sit with. And the passage doesn't soften it. Faithfulness recorded here isn't validated by outcome. It's recorded as complete in itself, in the moment it happened, regardless of what followed. The absence of a resolved ending also means the account resists being turned into a formula. There's no promise here that giving everything produces provision or that faithfulness under hardship guarantees relief afterward. The text simply states what she did and how it was weighed, leaving the rest genuinely open. Most stories about giving include a return. Something comes back, provision arrives, the sacrifice gets vindicated by results. This one doesn't. 4 verses, 2 coins, 1 observation from someone sitting across the courtyard, and then she's gone. For anyone whose own giving hasn't produced a visible return, that absence may be the most useful part of the account. It doesn't establish a transaction. It establishes that the act was already complete, already weighed, already recorded as the largest contribution of the day, that happened before anything else did or failed to. There's a final detail worth carrying forward. The word Mark uses for what she had left, nothing, is stark and absolute. Not a small remainder, not a modest cushion. The text records her giving her entire means of living in a single afternoon. She gave it to an institution she had every reason, based on the immediately preceding verses, to distrust. What the text does record is that someone sat down deliberately and watched an entire courtyard of people give. He singled out the contribution that nobody else in the building would have counted. She, out of her poverty, put in everything she had.